Today I'm going to be critiquing Jordan Peterson's political philosophy, which I've condensed down into three main ideas. First, don't engage in politics unless your personal life is in order. Second, hierarchies should be preserved. And third, identity politics are dangerous. I'm going to go through each of these three ideas and discuss my critiques of them, so let's get into it. So Peterson's first big idea is that people should clean their rooms before trying to improve the world. Basically, he thinks that if your personal life is a mess, your insights about politics and how the world should operate cannot be trusted. So there is some truth to this, because all else being equal, I think I trust someone who has their personal life in order to have better insights about how we should structure our society. But it's just empirically wrong to say that people who have messy personal lives can't change the world for the better. A prime example of this would be Martin Luther King Jr., who was a notorious adulterer and womanizer, which really strained his relationship with his wife. But despite that, he still had an undeniably positive impact on the world. And there's another problem with Peterson's line of reasoning, which is that sometimes the reason your life is a mess is because of bigger, more structural forces. For example, if you feel that there are laws that severely limit your economic opportunities, you might have to engage in politics in order to get your room clean. And I think maybe the strongest argument that I can make to rebut Peterson's claim is that he doesn't even believe it himself. He's been struggling with major depression, drug dependency, and an autoimmune disease for a very long time, but that hasn't stopped him from trying to change the world. Peterson's second big idea is that hierarchies form because not everyone is equally competent at achieving what society values. As a result, hierarchies form where the most talented people are at the top and the least talented people are at the bottom. Therefore, hierarchies should be preserved, because we want to live in a world where some people are exceptionally talented. We don't want to drag the people at the top down to the bottom and force them to be no more talented than anyone else. So I think he's really arguing against a straw man here, because very few people on the left think that inequality in talent is inherently problematic. Everyone acknowledges that some people have more competence than others when it comes to any skill that you can think of, such as math. There are two things that they might actually be saying. The first is that the current hierarchy is not solely based on competence. It's also influenced by bigotry and discrimination. There's lots of evidence for this view. One compelling example is resume studies. So when resumes that are identical, except for the fact that some of them have stereotypically black names on them and some have stereotypically white names on them, are sent out to a bunch of companies, the ones with white names have much higher callback rates, which would imply that our hierarchies are based on competence as well as discrimination based on identity characteristics. The second reason people criticize hierarchies is that even if a hierarchy is based on competence, it can feel unjust because not everyone has access to the same resources that maximize their competence. For example, being impoverished lowers your competence, but that's not the fault of people who were born into poverty. And I'm not saying the solution to this problem is to pretend incompetent people are more competent than they actually are. But maybe the solution going forwards is to invest more resources into underprivileged people so that their position on the hierarchy is more of a function of their personal traits and less a function of the circumstances or identities that they were born into. Peterson's third main idea is that because all hierarchies are based on competence, people who engage in identity politics have no legitimate grievances. They're just upset that they or other people in their group are not competent. And moreover, he claims that identity politics are bad because they often devolve into tribalism and people hating people who don't share the same identities as them. So I actually think Peterson is right about that last part. Identity politics often devolves into a needlessly adversarial zero-sum contest between people of different identities. But it doesn't always. It's possible to practice identity politics without needlessly demonizing anyone. And there are tons of examples of this. The civil rights movement in the 60s, the gay rights movement in the 80s, and even some of the modern movements for police and prison reform. By the way, it's worth pointing out that even if you make a point of not needlessly demonizing anyone, some people will feel demonized. Case in point, Martin Luther King Jr.'s version of the civil rights movement made a lot of white people feel very uncomfortable. So the bottom line is that Peterson is wrong to have a hard and fast rule about being opposed to identity politics. He's right that movements based on identity politics sometimes do go off the rails, but it is absurd to be principally opposed to identity politics, as they're often necessary to counteract laws or cultural norms that are rooted in prejudice against identities.